It's week number 3 of Christianity 101, the week where we talk about God's existence and the world's brokenness. God's existence and the world's brokenness. I'm so glad you chose to join us to talk through this material. I'm sorry that you have to put up with me, but you will see a mixture of presenters as we continue to walk through this material. I just want to get us rolling on a subject that is very hard and honestly for many of our presenters is very intimidating. And I don't know that I'll do the best job, but I sure hope that as you have questions and want to go into deeper explanation on these topics, that you reach out to someone that you know or reach out to us, either through the web or through our group meetings, and give us a chance to talk more about specific questions you have related to these subjects. Last week we talked about the Bible's reliability. This week we're going to talk about the paradigm that the Bible gives us in which to view the world, and we'll talk about how it fits, we think, and explains reality so much better than many of the other religious viewpoints that are out there. So God's existence and our brokenness. Two big subjects that we're going to package together because we really feel like seeing them together will help you deal better with what God is doing in your life and how better you connect the spiritual realm to the arguments that are out there in the world today. Our big idea is that you see not only that God exists, but that He is passionately pursuing you. And He's passionately pursuing you to the point that the one thing that keeps Him at bay is the world's brokenness. And so we're going to talk about what it means for God to passionately pursue you, why He does that, and again, how we see life through that paradigm. When we talk about existence, particularly God's existence, there's one key paradigm we need to remember and understand. So often science gets tied to this, and science really is our paradigm for talking about existence, but we have to make sure we understand that this is the science of origins, not the science of experimentation. When you do experiments, you can prove certain things, but when you talk about past events, you can only look at the most probable causes for those events. When you're in a court case and you're trying to prove something, there's no way to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that something happened in a specific way. You can always bring skepticism and criticism towards evidence that someone would bring forth. And so what we do when we look at origins, when we look at God's existence, is we just ask the question, what's the most probable explanation for the world that I see around me today? And for the evidence that I see in the past? And so there are many people who try to explain those, both from religious standpoints and irreligious standpoints. Creation and evolution is a big topic that gets debated all the time. And a few hundred miles from here in Cincinnati, Ohio, is a creationist museum that chooses to, in a very visual and physical way, get you to interact with the idea that maybe looking through the lens of creation is better than looking through the lens of evolution. Evolution makes the same arguments. And we just want you to, again, look through both lenses and ask yourself, what's the most probable explanation for the events that I see in front of me? That being said, there are several arguments that I want to walk you through that just kind of categorize ways that people see the evidence and explanations that they're willing to consider in relation to why the world is the way it is today. The most popular one, probably in our current time, is the intelligent design argument. So often this is called the watchmaker argument. Once upon a time, a guy used the example of finding a watch on the sidewalk to explain the basic philosophy behind the intelligent design argument. That if you're walking down the sidewalk and you find a watch, you will look at it, pick it up, and not think that dust particles randomly assembled to create this watch. No, you'll probably think this was created by an intelligent designer, probably a few in a factory somewhere who spent a lot of time R&D in putting that together. That's the intelligent design argument in its basic consequence, that we see systems and we see beauty in this world that just is beyond the explanation that a random series of events made those things come together. And honestly, it's not a bad argument. In fact, the Bible tends to say some things that reflect upon that people looking at the world really do see God as intelligent and as a beautiful artist in the worlds of creation. I want to read you a song from the Psalm book, Psalm 19, that just kind of talks through this. I think you'll like the words, and hopefully they'll resonate with you as I did. The psalmist writes, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. Their voice goes throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." It's a beautiful passage. And again, it's just talking about how when people look at the world around them, they really do see intelligence in the design that surrounds them. It's probably one of the biggest objections to the creation of the evolutionary argument, is simply that people find the complex systems that exist in organic life today too complex to have arisen by chance, even the chance of natural selection, which, to its credit, is a way that better systems could have evolved by random chance. This argument from intelligent design is so compelling that Paul even wrote in his letter to the church in Rome some words about it. Let me read you those as well. He says this. He says that what can be known about God is plain to humanity because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, and that man is without excuse when they deny God. That is just Paul's reflection on this very thought of intelligent design. And again, these aren't arguments specifically for some philosophy, but they do resonate with that subject of looking at the world through the lens of an intelligent designer. The second argument that gets made quite often is an argument of conscience, that our moral standards that seem somehow to be universally implanted in so many people really speak to the fact that there is a moral creator behind the universe's world as well, that he created us with a moral compass that is universal to humanity, that truly points us towards an internal standard of law. In fact, Paul, again, arguing for the Creator, when he's writing to his friends in the church in Rome, writes something very similar. He says this. He says, when non-Jews who don't have a law, by nature do what our law requires, they're a law to themselves, even though they don't have it. They show that the work of the law is written in their hearts. Their conscience bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or excuse even them. He goes on to say, therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another you condemn yourself, because you practice the very same things. So again, when you make a moral judgment or criticism of somebody else who's out there, so often remember that there's some bearing inside of you that's maybe not existent just from your society, but seems to be somewhat universal and speaks to a moral creator who's behind the world and who put it together. Another argument that comes up quite often is an argument from history, that people just look at the historical record of the Bible that contains over 6,000 years of world history, and they talk about how can a book be so accurate just by random chance and be preserved so well over 6,000 years? That's got to be evidence for the fact that there's a God out there who wanted to get a message to us. And again, I think that's a compelling argument. There are many, many things that scholars have wished to disprove for years that the Bible faithfully puts out there. And though we don't have evidence to prove every historical event that happened in the Bible, we certainly have a lot of evidence that correlates really well to what we see in the world today, in the Middle East, and even outside of it. That argument from history is often tied very closely to the argument of Jesus' life as well, because Jesus was a historical person. And most people talk about how Jesus truly not only was his teaching stupendous, and did he make radical claims that people chose to accept at one time that seems evidence of the fact that God was really with us here on earth, but they talk about how compelling it is that we have 4 accounts of a man's life who was relatively unknown and had no reason to have a record recorded of him, and who was claimed by all 4 accounts to have died and to have literally risen from the dead and proved to everybody who followed him that he truly had something meaningful to say, and that he truly had purpose. And that ultimately, if you read his words, his purpose was to prove to us that there is one God, that he exists, and that he's pursuing us. Hebrews writes it this way, another beautiful passage that I just want to send to you guys. Hebrews 1 says, long ago God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways through the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us through his Son, who he appointed heir of all things. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. That's the convincing thought that most people have when they read the words of Jesus and the life of Jesus, is that he truly was God, and that his life, particularly his resurrection, proves that there is a God out there. And it also proves, as Jesus spoke of himself, that the words in Scripture truly are God's message to us. So there's the argument of history, the argument of Jesus. There's also the argument from our own lives. As Jesus was ending his ministry, he talked about how our incredible love for one another as human beings, based on what he had done for us, that was going to be evidence to the world that he had come and that God existed. Christians in history and Christians today do love many times in radical ways that people have real trouble explaining outside of a loving God who created them. A very simple example from our modern era is the hospitals that exist today. If you look around at those, most of those were started by Catholics or Protestants who really just wanted to serve the sick. They wanted to serve other people, and the sick were a very, very needy segment of that population. And so they created hospitals not to make money. Ultimately, they were treating people for free in many cases at the beginning, and it just became an organization and an enterprise and eventually a business that took off, but that still bears the name Baptist, as we have in Nashville, or Catholic Charities, as you see many places around, or St. Jude Children's Hospital that most people have heard of. These are just incredible ministries that truly kick off and show that there is a love that seems otherworldly that exists in our world today, and that's hard to explain through other paradigms. The last argument that a lot of people use, and again, I think a very legitimate one, is just the argument from personal experience, particularly in the Christian sense. We talk about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. When God came into my life at age 11, I truly felt a major change, a major shift happen, where I felt like I was connected to a God who spoke to me, who I could respond to, and who was empowering me to do things in the world that I never knew I could do. That personal experience speaks very strongly to me just of the existence of God. That God not only relates to me through history, He has not improved Himself in the way that I see the world around me, but that truly He is active in my life even today. And that I get hints of Him working specifically. Maybe not doing miracles, but doing things that just seem far beyond random consequence. And that truly prove to me that God exists. And I think that is a great evidence for Christianity. In fact, when I share my faith with people, a lot of times what I simply do, especially when I don't have much time, is I just talk about how God has changed my life. And to me, that is one of the greatest proofs that Christianity exists and that God truly is active and pursuing us in this life. So one of the great proofs of Christianity truly is personal experience of it. And the thing that you need to understand is that that personal experience is also correlated often to why people disbelieve God as well. You see, we're looking through the lens of probability. What's the most probable explanation for the world around me? And people, especially in our culture, who think of the Christian God as a good-natured God, a God who wants to do good things, they see the broken world around them. They experience the brokenness of this world around them through evil people or just people who are not caring much about them. And that evil breaks the paradigm of what a good God they feel like would do. They just know that the Christian God is supposed to be a good God, a loving God, and they don't feel love at points in their life. And that personal experience is what destroys the paradigm that they feel like proves that God exists. And so they choose to reject God in a broken world. And that is an acceptable paradigm for those who don't know much about the Bible or about how God relates to us. You see, I think that's the reason why when God creates His message for the world, the very beginning is not just about why God exists. It's about the world God created, what He wanted for it, and why it is broken. You see, when you open up the first pages of the Bible and read the first book, it begins with, in the beginning, God created the sky and the earth. And it goes on to talk about how the world was good, like we expect it to be, like we hope it would be for a good God who created it. In fact, that phrase gets repeated over and over and over. The beginning opens in a creative, poetic account where it talks about God creating this in day 1 and day 2 and day 3. And in each day, it concludes with, and it was good. God saw that it was good. He ultimately created a good world for us, a world that we long for. And those things are perfect and expected for us. In fact, when He creates human beings in the last day, it not only says that the world was good, it says the world was very good. And that's kind of exciting to think of God creating a perfect world for us. But why isn't the world perfect? Why is it that we find brokenness all around us? Well, you see, that's just it. It's really not the Creator's problem. It's our problem. It's a problem our ancestors chose to make. And that's where the next chapters go. Because God doesn't want to leave us with a perfect world paradigm, and He doesn't want to leave us with an argument that He simply exists. He wants to explain the paradigm that we have to see the world by. And so 1, 2, and 3, the first 3 pages of the Bible explain why our world is broken. And you may have heard this, I'm sure you've seen a picture of it, of Adam and Eve walking in the garden holding a piece of fruit. They had the choice not between one piece of fruit, but between 2. You see, the very first tree that's mentioned being placed in the Garden of Eden is not the tree that they sinned by eating from. It's the tree of life. It was a tree, as far as we can tell, that was capable of sustaining life on an eternal scale and allowing people to become eternal beings in the sense that their physical body lasted just as long as their spiritual body. But Adam and Eve chose to ignore that tree and instead chose a tree that God warned them not to choose. And He made it very clear what they were choosing. The tree was named the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you can't experience evil unless you're in a broken world. And so when Adam and Eve take the fruit of the tree, not trust what God had said and not heed His warning, they break the world and they choose to experience evil. And every one of their descendants, their children, their children's children, their children's children's children, and ultimately us, their descendants, experience the very same evil that they chose to experience, because they chose the knowledge of good and evil. And when God comes down, He's very gracious to them, actually. You'll notice that one of the first things He does is He clothes them, because they're naked and they're embarrassed that they're naked now. And He chooses to clothe them. But then He talks about the consequences of what they have chosen. He talks about how, for man, nature is going to be just as broken as he is. That not only is he going to be spiritually in rebellion to God, which he is by choosing to eat the fruit, but that nature is going to deteriorate. The second law of thermodynamics says that the world is moving from order to disorder. And that's what we see in nature. We see a world in which nature is not well controlled, where it gets out of control, where genes mutate and fall and become corrupt, where we see fruit does not last consistently, and where we struggle to provide enough food for everyone to eat. And that's what God says. God says, at one time this world was going to produce plentifully, but now that you're going to have to work hard for food, because the world is going to suffer from the consequences of you choosing to experience evil. When He speaks to the woman, He talks about her physical body, how her physical body is going to deteriorate. And a big consequence of that is going to be that childbirth is going to be one of the most painful experiences of her life. We can say that's true. And we can say that not only is childbirth painful, but that we have diseases now, we have genetic problems, and we have children who are born with disabilities. And they suffer from imperfection that we introduced in this world by our choice. And unfortunately, so often, those who had no choice in the matter experience horrible evils in this world, simply because they pay for the consequences of their ancestors. And that's not just Adam and Eve. That's the consequences of all of us. Because we know that when you pollute this world, everybody feels the effects of that a little bit. That when you choose to be selfish and hurt somebody, that has a ripple effect that goes out through relationships. And though you may not know who you've affected with your sin, and a nation may not know who it's affected with its own selfishness, truly, our selfishness affects everything. So we have nature that doesn't cooperate and is no longer perfect. We have physical bodies that don't cooperate and are no longer perfect and deteriorate. And we have a spiritual paradigm that follows just like Adam's, that's in rebellion to God. We don't have to teach a 2-year-old to be selfish, to lie, even to hit when he's trying to get his way. And that reflects upon a nature that just isn't respecting God and doesn't love others as much as he loves himself. The way God ultimately wanted this world to work, the perfect world He ultimately created for us. When you experience and lose hope the way that so often we do when we're in these situations, it hurts, and we can lose sight of the fact that God created us. But God tried to explain that we were going to live in a broken world, and that ultimately that wasn't His desire, but it was our choice. And when you lose hope like that, well, in some ways I can understand that. The thing, though, that you want to take courage by, and the thing I want to end on today, is that humans were not an afterthought. In so many creation accounts that you read from ancient times, like the Greek gods, humans were just servants created to serve these bold, selfish, powerful beings. It's not that way in God's world. We were the pinnacle of creation. We were the last thing God created, and the thing that He said would reflect who He was in His very nature. His love, His capacity for creativity, His capacity for romance. So many amazing things that God has given us. So humans are not an afterthought. And though we have rebelled against God, He has not abandoned us. He knew when Adam and Eve had sinned in the garden. And yet He chose to come down and to walk with them, and to talk with them, and to clothe them. And He does the very same for us. That though we struggle, though we are selfish beings, He is passionately pursuing us in ways that just amaze me, even to this very day. And that ultimately God doesn't just exist, but that He loves us. And that it is the world's brokenness, it is rebellion, society-wide and individually, that keeps Him from us. And that's where I want to leave you this week, with some questions to think about and some thoughts to process on that subject. And if you have specific objections or arguments that you need to process, well, by all means, grab me or one of your group leaders, grab a friend, and talk through those issues together. Thanks, and we'll see you in week 4.